Chapter 1. Introduction. Why aircraft carriers are the most powerful ships in the world. Since time immemorial, the great empires of the world have tried to carry their power beyond the borders of their own territory. At first, it was chariots and horses that moved armies faster. Then it was sailing ships that crossed oceans and conquered distant continents. But in the 20th century, a symbol was added that stands for global power more than any other: the aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier is much more than just a ship. It is a floating city, a mobile airport in the middle of the ocean, an instrument that allows a country to deploy its air forces anywhere in the world, regardless of foreign ports or bases. Where an aircraft carrier appears, the power structure of the region changes. For enemies, it means a constant threat. For allies, a visible sign of protection and strength. But this role did not develop overnight. In the beginning, there were not gigantic floating fortresses like today's American supercarriers, but fragile experiments with wooden decks and converted cruisers. At first, no one knew whether it was even possible to have aircraft reliably take off and land from a ship. It was an idea that was still considered adventurous in the years before the First World War, and yet it was to change warfare at sea forever. Aircraft carriers are not just weapons, they are symbols. They embody the technological progress of their time and the geopolitical ambitions of their nations. They are floating ambassadors who can engage in diplomacy as well as wage wars. An aircraft carrier in the port of a friendly nation is a promise that protection and help are always available. An aircraft carrier off the coast of a rival is a reminder that you could strike at any time. This symbolic power becomes particularly clear in the 20th century. Without aircraft carriers, the Second World War in the Pacific would have been different. Battles like Midway or the Coral Sea would not have taken place without these new giants of the sea. Later, during the Cold War, American and Soviet fleets faced each other, and the carriers were the visible sign that any conflict could take on global dimensions. Today, in the 21st century, it is the aircraft carrier that makes the power of the USA, China, or Great Britain visible on the world's oceans. But at the same time, aircraft carriers tell a story of change. They originated from small experiments with biplanes that needed barely 20 meters of deck, and developed into ships over 300 meters long that can take more than 70 modern jets on board. Their decks became runways, their hangars became workshops, their crews became floating parties of over 5,000 people. The history of aircraft carriers is thus not only a history of ships, but a history of ideas, technology, and power politics. It begins with daredevil pioneers who had planes take off on converted cruisers, leads to the great battles of the Second World War, which decided the fate of entire nations, to the modern supercarriers, which are considered floating symbols of global domination. When we look at the history of aircraft carriers, we see more than just steel and machinery. We see the longing of nations to be present everywhere in the world. We see how technical visions became reality, and how entire strategies of naval warfare changed. Above all, however, we see a symbol that remains unbroken. Whoever owns an aircraft carrier has the key to global power. Chapter 2. The Beginnings. First ideas of flying boats and motherships before 1914. The history of aircraft carriers does not begin with a clear plan, but with an idea that sounded almost crazy at first. At the beginning of the 20th century, aviation itself was still young. The Wright brothers had made the first motorized flight in 1903, and in the years that followed, airplanes got better and better, but they were fragile machines made of wood, cloth, and wire. Hardly anyone seriously thought about connecting them to the mighty world of warships. But yet the thought was obvious. Even in the first years after the pioneer flights, military strategists asked themselves, couldn't the range of aircraft be massively increased if they were stationed at sea? Couldn't a ship serve as a floating base from which to undertake reconnaissance flights over vast oceans? The range of the early aircraft was tiny. They could only cover short distances. But a ship that carried them could take them where they were needed. The first experiments were simple and improvised. In 1910, the American pilot Eugene Ely dared a daring maneuver. He took off with his biplane from a makeshift wooden ramp that had been mounted on the deck of the cruiser USS Birmingham. The flight was short and dangerous, but it succeeded. The first takeoff of an aircraft from a warship. Just a few months later, Ely went one better. He landed his plane on a platform that had been built over the stern of the battleship USS Pennsylvania. He used simple safety ropes stretched by sailors to slow down his machine. With this maneuver, he had shown that takeoff and landing of ships were possible. Similar experiments began to be carried out in Europe as well. The British tested the use of aircraft that were launched from ships with cranes. These so-called seaplanes were supposed to take off from the water and land again, while the mothership only served them as a transport and supply platform. Soon after, the first ships were converted specifically for such aircraft, not yet carriers in the modern sense, but the predecessors. The French Navy, the Royal Navy, and also the Japanese watched these developments closely. It was still unclear whether aircraft would play a major role in the war at all. Many admirals considered them to be gimmicks, at best suitable for reconnaissance, but never for combat. For the mighty guns of the battleships were considered the undisputed rulers of the sea. But there were visionaries who thought ahead. They realized that an aircraft that could fly far ahead would provide a squadron with crucial information about enemy movements, coastal positions, or submarine dangers. As early as 1914, the first ships were equipped with decks and hangars to carry seaplanes. They were not yet aircraft carriers as we know them, but they were the first floating air bases. As Europe moved towards the First World War, it was clear that the connection between ship and aircraft was more than just a technical experiment. It was the beginning of a revolution, because whoever could control the sky above the sea would also redefine naval supremacy.
Chapter 3: World War I, Seaplanes, HMS Furious, and the Birth of Carriers. When the First World War broke out in 1914, aviation was still in its infancy, and hardly anyone could imagine that it would play a decisive role in this gigantic conflict. But after the first months of the war, it became clear that aircraft were indispensable for reconnaissance and observation. They could scout enemy positions, track troop movements, and spot ships long before they were in sight. What worked on land was also wanted to be used at sea, and this was the beginning of the actual birth of aircraft carriers. The first attempts were modest. Warships were equipped with small platforms from which light aircraft could take off. Landing was usually not planned. The pilots had to return to land after their mission or go down in the water to be picked up by ships. Even more important were so-called seaplane motherships, converted passenger ships or freighters carrying large seaplanes on board. They were placed in the sea with cranes, took off from the surface of the water, and were hoisted back on deck after their use. These ships had the advantage that they made reconnaissance flights far out into the ocean possible. A famous example was the British HMS Engadine, a former ferry steamer that was converted into a seaplane carrier. She took part in the Battle of Skagerrak in 1916, the largest naval battle of the war. Although its contribution was limited, it proved that aircraft could provide valuable services to the fleet. Even more exciting were the experiments with real starting decks. The Royal Navy experimented with platforms on cruisers and battleships. HMS Furious became particularly famous, originally a battlecruiser that was rebuilt several times during the war. Initially, she was given a flight deck at the bow, later another at the stern. Soon, the engineers realized that a continuous flight deck was the best solution. Furious became the first real carrier with a long deck from which planes could take off and, at least theoretically, land again. During the First World War, these ships were used for the first attacks, including an attack on the German Zeppelin hangars in Thunder in 1918. British Sopwith Camels took off from the Furious, bombed the hulls, and destroyed several airships. It was the first airstrike from an aircraft carrier, an inconspicuous, almost forgotten mission, but in truth, the beginning of a new era. Other nations also experimented. France built ships for seaplanes, the Japanese watched closely, and the USA soon sent the USS Langley into the race as its first own carrier. But the decisive impulses in this war came from the British. They realized that with a flat deck, the ship could be more than an auxiliary platform for airplanes. It could become the heart of a fleet. When the First World War ended in 1918, the revolution was not yet complete, but it had begun. Aircraft carriers were still small, their aircraft weak, and their missions rare, but the idea was born. It had been seen that planes launched from a ship could attack enemy bases, detect ships, and influence naval supremacy. The great maritime powers learned their lessons from this, and soon a race would begin that would forever change warfare at sea.
Chapter 4. The Interwar Period, the Great Experiments in the 1920s. World War I had shown that airplanes could be used from ships, but by the end of the war, aircraft carriers were still more of an idea than a full-blown weapon. The years after 1918, therefore, offered room for experimentation. In the 1920s, the major maritime powers made their first serious attempts to establish carriers as an integral part of their fleets. The Royal Navy, which had already pioneered the war with HMS Furious and other ships, continued to develop it consistently. The unfinished battlecruiser HMS Eagle became one of the first true carriers with a continuous deck. Of particular importance was HMS Hermes, which was commissioned in 1924 and was the first carrier to be designed as such from the outset. She was a comparatively small ship, but her clear design with hangar, elevator, and flight deck formed the basic model for all later aircraft carriers. Experiments were also carried out in the USA. In 1922, the coal ship USS Jupiter became the USS Langley, America's first carrier. It was slow, unwieldy, and could only accommodate a small number of aircraft, but it served as an experimental laboratory. On it, landing procedures, safety ropes, and catapults were tried out. The knowledge gained there was to form the basis for future generations of American wearers. Japan, which worked closely with Britain as an emerging maritime power, was particularly attentive. From battlecruisers, which were actually intended for war, it converted the carriers Akagi and Paga. These ships were significantly larger and more powerful than the early British and American models. The Japanese Navy recognized early on that carriers were not only auxiliary ships for reconnaissance, but could be a weapon in their own right. This foresight was to pay off later in the Second World War. The interwar period was characterized by technical curiosity, but also by political restrictions. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 set upper limits on the size and number of warships to prevent an arms race after World War I. However, the contracting parties decided not to scrap certain battlecruisers and battleships, but to convert them into aircraft carriers. Thus, the giants that never sailed for naval battles became the world's first truly great carriers. During this time, it became clear that the aircraft carrier could be more than an escort ship. Admirals debated vigorously whether he could one day even displace the battleship, which had been considered the symbol of naval power for centuries. Many still held on to the cannon fortresses, but the aircraft became more powerful and their range and effectiveness grew. More and more often, the question arose, could an aircraft carrier sink a battleship with its air power long before it came within range with its guns? The 1920s did not yet provide a definitive answer to this question, but they laid the foundations. Technical innovations such as catapults, hooks, and landing ropes were developed. The organization on board was tested: how to hangar aircraft, how to refuel them, arm them, and get them ready for takeoff. They learned that the aircraft carrier was not just a ship with a deck, but a highly complex system that required meticulous planning and discipline. So this decade was a time of learning. Improvised platforms became specialized ships. Experiments became doctrine. As the 1930s began, the major naval powers were ready to see the aircraft carrier no longer just as a complement, but as a potential centerpiece of their fleets. The next Great War would show that this premonition was correct.
Chapter 5. The U.S. and the USS Langley, America's First Steps. When the United States began to think about the future of its Navy after World War I, one question arose: should America take on the role of a global maritime power? The answer was still cautious in the 1920s, but an experiment showed in which direction the future was heading: the USS Langley. The Langley was originally a coal carrier, the USS Jupiter.
Instead of decommissioning it after the end of the war, it was decided to rebuild it. In 1922, she was launched as the first American aircraft carrier. It was slow, unwieldy, and could only accommodate a small number of aircraft, but it was the testing ground where the U.S. Navy learned how to operate an aircraft carrier. The pilots stationed on the Langley had to do pioneering work. Taking off and landing on the narrow deck was a dangerous adventure. There were no sophisticated hooks or hydraulic brake ropes yet, and often the first attempts ended in crash landings. Nevertheless, it was possible to develop procedures that soon became routine. They learned how to store aircraft in the hangar, how to bring them up with elevators, and in what order to organize takeoffs and landings. The Langley was not a ship for battle. Their speed was not enough to keep up with the fleet, and their size only allowed the operation of around 36 aircraft. But her value lay in training. It was used to train an entire generation of American naval aviators, which would later be decisive in World War II. Meanwhile, the development continued. This was soon followed by two larger ships that emerged from unfinished battlecruisers, the USS Lexington and the USS Saratoga. These carriers, which entered service in the late 1920s, were gigantic compared to the Langley. They could accommodate more than 80 aircraft and had the speed to keep up with the most modern battleships. This meant that the U.S. Navy suddenly had ships that were not only experimental but also combat-ready. The Lexington and the Saratoga were intensively tested in the following years. Exercises were carried out in which they attacked enemy ports or simulated landings. In one famous exercise, they even attacked the Panama Canal, symbolically of course, and showed that a carrier aircraft could theoretically take out one of the most important strategic targets of the United States. These experiments made it clear that aircraft carriers were capable of doing much more than just reconnaissance. They could themselves become the decisive percussion instrument. In the 1930s, the aircraft became more powerful. Instead of small biplanes, the carriers could now accommodate more modern aircraft that could be heavier loaded and fly further. The U.S. Navy began to refine its operational doctrine. The battleship was still the heart of the fleet, but more and more often the admiral saw the real future in the carriers. The USS Langley itself remained a training ship that tirelessly trained pilots. Its slow speed made it unsuitable for emergencies, and so it was converted into a supply and aircraft ferry in the 1930s. But her legacy was much larger than her small hull suggested. It was the beginning, the first step of the USA into a new era of naval warfare. When World War II reached America in 1941, it was precisely the men who had practiced their first takeoffs and landings on the Langley that would make the difference. The inconspicuous ship, which began as a coal transporter, was thus the cradle of the American aircraft carrier doctrine, and thus a key moment in the history of global maritime power.
Chapter 6. Great Britain as a Pioneer, Ark Royal, Courageous, and the Royal Navy. As the world's most traditional maritime power, Great Britain had a special relationship with innovations on the oceans. The Royal Navy was the fleet that held the empire together, secured trade routes, and connected colonies. No wonder, then, that the British recognized early on the potential of the aircraft carrier. During the First World War, they had already achieved their first real pioneering achievements with HMS Furious, HMS Engadine, and HMS Argus. In the 1920s and 1930s, they built on this and made Britain a leading nation in carrier development. Particularly symbolic was the HMS Ark Royal, which was commissioned in 1938. She was the first large British aircraft carrier to be designed for this purpose from the beginning. Unlike the Hermes, which was more of a prototype, the Ark Royal already embodied the vision of a modern fleet, a ship that could take dozens of aircraft, take off and land quickly, and keep up with the speed of the fleet. With its long, continuous deck and powerful elevators, it became a role model for generations to come. But the Royal Navy not only had new ships, but also ideas. In the 1920s, several Courageous-class battlecruisers were converted to aircraft carriers: HMS Courageous, HMS Glorious, and HMS Furious, which continued to serve as a real carrier after conversions.
These ships were large, fast, and could accommodate many aircraft. They were the first serious carriers of the Royal Navy that could be tested in real operations. They were used to conduct exercises that showed how carriers could be integrated into a fleet. Aircraft took off on reconnaissance missions, symbolically attacking enemy targets and protecting their own ships from surprise attacks. Gradually, the British admirals realized that aircraft carriers opened up a whole new dimension of naval warfare, the third dimension, the sky. Great Britain placed particular emphasis on the defense of its carriers. Early on, it was recognized how vulnerable a ship with a large open deck was. Therefore, the Royal Navy experimented with armored flight decks. While American and Japanese carriers built their decks as light as possible to accommodate more aircraft, the British invested in protection. The idea was that a British carrier should still fight even if it was hit directly. This decision would later prove far-sighted during the Second World War, especially in the Mediterranean. The aircraft also continued to develop. In the 1920s, biplanes dominated, which were still rather slow and vulnerable. But in the 1930s, the machines became more modern. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters were created, which gave the carriers real punch. The Royal Navy began to organize its carrier groups in such a way that they could operate independently, an important experience for the coming war years. HMS Ark Royal became the pride of the fleet and the symbol of this new era. When she was launched in 1938, she was one of the most modern ships in the world. No one suspected at the time that she would sink in the Atlantic just a few years later, but her short service impressively showed how much wearers were taking center stage. Overall, it was the Royal Navy that was the first to prove that aircraft carriers could be more than just support ships. It turned experiments into real warships, tested new tactics, and set standards for other nations. Even if the USA and Japan were soon to overtake in terms of size and effectiveness, it remains undisputed that without the British pioneers, the modern aircraft carrier would not have existed in this form.
Chapter 7: Japan Enters, Akagi, Kaga, and the Imperial Navy's Dream. While the British and Americans were gaining their first experience with aircraft carriers in the 1920s, Japan was watching closely and decided to go down this path even more decisively. The Imperial Navy had the goal of playing a dominant role in the Pacific, and it knew that to do so, it would have to compete with the strongest maritime powers in the world. Battleships were still considered the symbol of naval supremacy, but in Japan, many admirals believed early on that the future was in the air. Japan, like other nations, began to rebuild. The two most famous examples were the Akagi and the Kaga. Originally, both ships were planned as battlecruisers and battleships, but the Washington Naval Treaty stopped many of these capital ships. Instead of scrapping them, it was decided to convert them into aircraft carriers. This gave Japan two of the most powerful carriers of their time, which were to form the backbone of the Japanese carrier fleet in the 1920s and 1930s. The Akagi, commissioned in 1927, was a massive ship with an unusual silhouette. Initially, it had 3 flight decks on top of each other, an experiment that soon proved impractical and was later abandoned in favor of a continuous deck. The Kaga, which followed in 1928, was similarly impressive and could accommodate a large number of aircraft. Both ships underwent extensive modernization in the 1930s and were given the appearance that would later make them famous during the Second World War: a long, wide deck, huge hangars, and a powerful air group. But Japan's strength lay not only in the ships themselves, but in its strategy. The Imperial Navy developed a doctrine early on that placed the aircraft carrier at the center. The plan was not to use individual carriers as escort ships, but to combine several carriers into a large strike group. This Kido Butai, the carrier combat group, was a radical innovation. While other nations often regarded their carriers as a complement to battleships, Japan saw them as the real tool to surprise, weaken, and destroy the enemy. In addition, there was the enormous discipline and professionalism of the Japanese naval aviators. Japan invested heavily in the training of its pilots, who trained for years and became the best carrier pilots in the world. Their attacks were precise, their coordination excellent. This combination of ships, doctrine, and people made the Imperial Navy perhaps the most modern carrier fleet in the world in the 1930s.
The bearers also had great symbolic significance. Japan was an island nation whose prosperity depended on the sea. For many Japanese, an aircraft carrier was a sign that the country could not only defend its coasts, but also reach far out, across the Pacific, to the colonies and trade routes of the Western powers. The Akagi and the Kaga were therefore not only weapons, but also political symbols that underlined Japan's claim to equality with Great Britain and the USA. When the 1930s drew to a close, the Imperial Navy was ready. It had several large carriers, a mature doctrine, and pilots of the highest quality. In doing so, Japan laid the groundwork for the first years of World War II, in which it was to celebrate spectacular successes. Successes that were only possible because the aircraft carrier had been placed at the center of its strategy early on.
Chapter 8. The 1930s. Technology, Doctrine, and the Rivalry of the Great Powers. The 1930s were a decade of tension, arms race, and ideological strife. While Europe was slowly heading for the next big war, and Asia was dominated by Japanese expansion, work was also being done feverishly on the world's oceans. The battleships still remained the kings of the fleet, but in the shadow of these giants, the aircraft carriers grew up and began to assert their place. Technically, this decade was a huge step forward. The aircraft developed rapidly. The slow, fragile biplanes of the 1920s became faster, more stable, and more powerful machines. Metal construction replaced wood and fabric. More powerful engines enabled higher speeds and longer ranges. And new types such as dive bombers and torpedo planes opened up completely new possibilities for attack. A carrier could now launch aircraft capable of sinking enemy ships with precise hits long before they themselves came within range of their guns. This technological development forced the navies to rethink their doctrines. In the USA, large fleet maneuvers led to the role of the carriers becoming increasingly clear. During exercises in the Pacific, the Lexington and Saratoga simulated attacks on ports and even on the Panama Canal, showing how vulnerable even key strategic positions were to carrier attacks. The U.S. Navy began to view the carrier not only as a support ship, but as an offensive tool. Britain followed its own path. The Royal Navy relied on the protection of its carriers and developed the concept of armored flight decks that could withstand bomb hits. At the same time, it saw the carrier primarily as part of a larger fleet that operated in conjunction with battleships and cruisers. The British were more cautious in their assessment, but they remained pioneers in technical innovations, such as the introduction of catapults and the organization of flight operations in a confined space. Japan, however, went the furthest. With the Kido Butai, the Imperial Navy developed the idea of combining several carriers into one large, powerful unit. This formation was able to launch a massive number of planes at the same time, strike in a coordinated manner, and overwhelm the enemy. It was a radical idea that assumed that the decisive blow against the enemy fleet would no longer be carried out by battleships, but by the Air Force. At the same time, the rivalry between the great powers grew. The Washington Naval Treaty had tried to limit an arms race, but in the 1930s, this system crumbled. Japan withdrew from the treaty in 1936. The United States and Britain planned new ships, and Germany began to rebuild the Kriegsmarine under Hitler's leadership. Aircraft carriers became a symbol of these developments. Those who owned them showed their claim to power projection and global presence. The public also began to notice the wearers. Newspapers reported on huge ships carrying entire fleets of planes, and people realized that something new was being created here. The wearer was no longer an experiment, but a sign of modernity. As the 1930s drew to a close, it was clear that the next major war would be fought not only with battleships and submarines, but also with aircraft carriers. They were ready to enter the stage of world history. And soon, in the first years of the Second World War, they were to prove that the admirals who had believed in them were right.
Chapter 9. Second World War. The bearers take the stage. When World War II broke out in 1939, the world's large fleets were still dominated by battleships. In the eyes of many admirals, it was unthinkable that any other ship could question their importance. But barely 2 years later, the reality was to change dramatically. The aircraft carrier became the center of naval warfare and finally ousted the battleship from the throne.
Even at the beginning of the war, it became apparent that aircraft from sea could pose a formidable threat. In November 1940, British carrier aircraft of HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian naval base at Taranto. In a nighttime operation, only 21 slow ferry Swordfish biplane bombers flew against the massive battleships of the Italian Navy. They severely damaged 3 of them with torpedoes, and suddenly it was clear that even the largest cannon fortresses were not safe from aircraft operating from a carrier. The attack on Taranto was a foretaste of what was to come. While the British celebrated their first successes in the Mediterranean, Japan was preparing perhaps the boldest blow in the history of the carrier in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, more than 350 aircraft launched their attack on Pearl Harbor from 6 Japanese carriers. Battleships, which until then had been considered invincible, were destroyed or severely damaged within a few hours. The world was shocked to see how a fleet could be virtually eliminated by carrier aircraft without a single enemy battleship in sight. Pearl Harbor finally marked the beginning of the age of aircraft carriers. The USA also quickly recognized the importance of its own carriers. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, it was not the battleships, but the carriers that kept America in the game in the Pacific. With quick blows against Japanese positions on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, but also in the famous Doolittle raid against Tokyo, the American carriers proved their flexibility and range. In 1942, the first real carrier versus carrier battles took place. In May, American and Japanese carrier fleets met in the Coral Sea, without the ships themselves ever being in sight. Planes were the only weapons that decided the battle. The battle ended in a draw, but it showed that the new form of naval warfare had become reality. Only a few weeks later, the Battle of Midway followed, in which the U.S. Navy sank 4 Japanese carriers and thus brought about the decisive turning point of the Pacific War. Without its carrier fleet, Japan was no longer able to maintain the initiative. From then on, it was the American carriers who led the advance, reconquering island by island and finally advancing as far as the Japanese home islands. The carriers also play an important role in Europe. The British deployed them in the Atlantic to protect convoys against German U-boats. Escort carriers, smaller versions of the large fleet aircraft carriers, became a crucial tool in anti-submarine warfare. Without them, supplies from the USA to Great Britain might have been cut off. At the same time, British carriers carried out daring operations, such as the attack on the German battleship Tirpitz in Norwegian fjords. At the end of World War II, the aircraft carrier was undisputedly the most important ship of any major fleet. Battleships still existed, but they only played a supporting role. The carrier had proven that it could threaten entire fleets and cities with its air power, and that it was flexible enough to operate in any ocean. The war had turned the carriers of experiments into indispensable weapons. Its silhouette, the long flight deck with planes taking off and landing, had become a symbol of modern naval warfare. And when the world entered the nuclear age in 1945, it was clear that the aircraft carrier would not disappear. On the contrary, it would now become the tool with which superpowers projected their power globally.
Chapter 10. Pearl Harbor, 1941, The Blow from the Air. The morning of December 7, 1941, began peacefully in Hawaii. The sun was rising over Oahu, sailors were having breakfast aboard their ships, and the mighty battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet were seemingly safe in the harbor of Pearl Harbor. But within a few hours, that image would turn into a burning catastrophe that changed the course of world history, and it was the power of the aircraft carriers that made this possible. Japan had been working towards this blow for months. The Imperial Navy knew that it needed a decisive advantage in the event of a war against the USA. America was economically and industrially superior, and only a massive first strike could enable the Japanese to secure their conquests in Asia. Under the command of Admiral Nagumo, a fleet of 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, secretly set off for Hawaii. There were more than 350 aircraft on board, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. When the first planes appeared over Pearl Harbor shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning, all hell broke loose. Torpedo bombers shot close to the surface of the water, their weapons hitting the battleships, which lay motionless in the harbor. Within minutes, the USS Arizona was torn apart by a huge explosion and sank with over 1,000 men on board. Other ships, such as the USS Oklahoma, capsized, while the USS West Virginia and the USS California were severely damaged. Black clouds of smoke rose everywhere. Dive bombers attacked hangars and airfields, destroying dozens of planes on the ground before they could even take off. Hunters swept across the island, shooting down American planes and holding down the defenses. It was an attack that surpassed everything that had been seen before in its precision and force. But as devastating as the blow was, it was not perfect. Because of all things, the aircraft carriers of the U.S. Pacific Fleet were not in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Coincidentally, the USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga were at sea. The Japanese destroyed the battleships, but the ships that would really decide the future of the war escaped them. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the definitive proof that aircraft carriers were the kings of modern naval warfare. With 6 ships, Japan had eliminated an entire fleet without the attackers themselves having come within range of enemy guns. It was the triumph of air over cannons, the beginning of the carrier age. Politically, the attack had equally dramatic consequences. The next day, the outraged American government declared war on Japan. Shortly thereafter, Germany also declared war on the United States, and America entered World War II with full force. Pearl Harbor thus combined the war in Europe and Asia into a real world war. For Japan, Pearl Harbor was initially an overwhelming success, but in the euphoria was also the beginning of the end. For America was now more determined than ever. The destroyed battleships could be replaced, and the industrial strength of the United States would produce a fleet within a few years that surpassed anything Japan could ever assemble. And the American aircraft carriers that had survived Pearl Harbor were soon to show that they would be the real victors of the coming Pacific War.
Chapter 11. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier duel in history. May 1942 brought a novelty in the history of naval warfare. For the first time, fleets met whose ships never came into sight, whose cannons never fired, and yet a massive battle was fought. It was the beginning of a new era, the Battle of the Coral Sea. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had achieved a series of spectacular successes. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines was under Japanese control, and the flag of the empire flew in much of Southeast Asia. Now Japan wanted to expand its influence southwards. The destination was Port Moresby in New Guinea, a key to cutting Australia off from the US and its allies. The Americans, however, had deciphered the Japanese plans. Admiral Nimitz knew that an advance against Port Moresby was imminent and sent a fleet to intercept the attack. In May 1942, 2 huge carrier groups met in the Coral Sea. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, and the smaller carrier Shoho on the Japanese side, and the USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown on the American side. The encounter was completely different from any battle before. The ships themselves remained invisible. Instead, both sides repeatedly launched waves of planes that searched, found, and attacked the enemy. On May 7, American pilots attacked the Shokaku. With torpedoes and bombs, they hit the small carrier so badly that it was on fire and sank in a few minutes. An American pilot enthusiastically announced, "Scratch 1 flat top," the first confirmed carrier shootdown by the USA. The next day, however, the Japanese struck back. Their bombers hit the Lexington hard. The proud ship was rocked by explosions, and although the crew fought valiantly, it eventually had to be abandoned. The Yorktown narrowly escaped, damaged but still operational. Strategically, the battle was a turning point. Although the USA had lost the Lexington, Japan had broken off the advance on Port Moresby. For the first time, Japanese expansion had been stopped. But even more important was the nature of the battle. Aircraft carriers had decided the battle alone. No battleship had played a role. It became clear to the world in the Coral Sea. The future of naval warfare was in the air. Those who had carriers and used them wisely could defeat entire fleets without being directly caught in the fire of enemy cannons. But this was only the beginning.
A few weeks later, an even greater battle was to follow, an encounter that decided the fate of the entire Pacific War, the Battle of Midway. Chapter 12, Midway, 1942, Turning Point of the Pacific War. Just 1 month after the Coral Sea, one of the most famous naval battles in history was to take place in June 1942, a battle that had a decisive influence not only on the course of the Pacific War, but also on the fate of Japan, the Battle of Midway. Japan was still on the offensive. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, wanted to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet once and for all. His plan was to attack Midway Island, a small but strategically important base in the Central Pacific. He hoped to lure the Americans out of their reserve and lead their remaining carriers into a trap. With 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, and a huge fleet behind them, Japan seemed unbeatable. But Yamamoto underestimated American deciphering. The U.S. intelligence service had broken the Japanese radio code and therefore knew about the plans. Admiral Nimitz took advantage of this and set a trap for the Japanese. 3 American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the battered USS Yorktown, lay in wait, ready for strike. On June 4, 1942, the battle began. Japanese planes attacked Midway and caused severe damage, but the island held out. Meanwhile, the Americans launched their own attacks. At first, everything was chaotic. Torpedo squadrons were lost, many pilots were shot down without scoring a hit. For a moment, it seemed as if fate would turn in Japan's favor. But then came the decisive turn. In the late morning, American dive bombers discovered the Japanese carrier fleet, just as its flight decks were full of refueled and armed aircraft that were being prepared for the next attack. Within minutes, bombs hit the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Huge explosions shook the ships, and within a very short time, 3 of the Japanese carriers were on fire and abandoned. Only the Hiryu remained and led a desperate counterattack that severely damaged Yorktown. But it too was eventually found and sunk by American bombers. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers, the heart of its carrier fleet. Midway was more than just a battle. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. Until then, Japan had the initiative, but after this blow, they were forced to go on the defensive. The U.S. Navy had shown that it could not only survive, but win. The myth of the invincibility of the Japanese Navy was destroyed. The Battle of Midway also made it clear that the aircraft carrier had replaced the battleship. The huge cannons of the Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, played no role. The battle had been decided by planes alone. Whoever controlled the air over the sea also ruled the sea. For Japan, Midway was a disaster from which it would never fully recover. For the USA, on the other hand, it was a triumph that determined the further course of the war. From now on, the American carriers took the initiative and began to reconquer island after island. Chapter 13, British and American Carriers in Europe, Atlantic and Mediterranean. While the major carrier battles made headlines in the Pacific, aircraft carriers also played a decisive, albeit often less spectacular, role in Europe. In the Atlantic and Mediterranean, they showed their versatility, not only as an offensive weapon, but also as vital defenders against invisible enemies such as submarines. In the Atlantic, the battle for the supply lines had been raging since 1939. Britain was dependent on vital supplies from the United States, but German submarines threatened the convoys. Battleships or cruisers could hardly avert this danger. A submarine was too small and too difficult to detect. Here, the so-called escort carriers came on the scene. These were smaller carriers, often converted from cargo ships, carrying only a handful of aircraft. But these machines were able to monitor vast areas of sea, detect and attack submarines long before they reached the convoy. Without these escort carriers, Great Britain might have lost in the Atlantic War. Their planes forced the submarines to stay underwater longer, which restricted their movements and made them more vulnerable. Together with radar and improved defensive tactics, the small carriers made a decisive contribution to breaking the necks of the wolf packs of the German Navy. In the Mediterranean, on the other hand, it was the Royal Navy's large fleet aircraft carriers that made the difference. Italy, and later Germany threatened the British supply routes to Malta and North Africa. Malta, the small island in the center of the Mediterranean, was a strategic base for the British, but it was constantly under siege by air raids and naval operations. Aircraft carriers were the only way to supply the island with supplies and new aircraft. Again and again, the Royal Navy risked everything to get convoys through to Malta. Carriers such as HMS Ark Royal and HMS Illustrious launched fighters to continue fighting from the island. Some of these missions ended tragically. The Ark Royal was torpedoed by a German submarine in 1941 and sank. The Illustrious was severely damaged. But their deployment kept Malta alive, and with it the British presence in the Mediterranean. Carriers also played a major role in attacks against the Italian fleet. The aforementioned attack on Taranto in 1940 was a prime example. With just a few dozen double-deckers, the British paralyzed the most modern battleship fleet in the Mediterranean. The success was so impressive that it inspired the Japanese to plan Pearl Harbor a year later. The Americans also used carriers in Europe from 1942 onwards, especially during the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch. Carrier-operated aircraft supported the landings, attacked German and Italian positions, and secured the convoys against attacks from the air. Without these floating airfields, an operation in the coastal regions, which are often difficult to access, would hardly have been conceivable. In Europe, for example, it became clear that the aircraft carrier did not only shine in the open ocean or in large naval battles. It was flexible, versatile, and adapted to any task, whether it was hunting submarines, supplying remote bases, or directly supporting landing operations. At the end of the war, it was clear that the carriers had also made the difference in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. They were not only the spearhead in the Pacific, but an indispensable tool in global war, making any other class of ship seem superfluous. Chapter 14: Kamikazes and the Hard Battle for Okinawa. As the war in the Pacific entered its final phase, all the harshness and desperation with which Japan fought for its survival became apparent. After the defeats of Midway, the Solomon Islands, and the Philippines, the Imperial Navy had lost most of its effectiveness. But the closer the Americans got to the home islands, the more bitter the resistance became. This was particularly evident in the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, one of the bloodiest chapters of the entire war, and the kamikaze attacks, which mainly targeted the American aircraft carriers. Okinawa, just a few hundred kilometers from Japan, was the springboard for the planned invasion of the main islands. The Americans knew they had to take the island to bring their bombers and carriers closer to Tokyo. The Japanese, on the other hand, saw the defense of Okinawa as the last chance to stop the advance, or at least make it as expensive as possible. In this desperate situation, Japan resorted to a new, shocking weapon, the kamikaze. Hundreds of young pilots were prepared to sacrifice their lives in a suicide attack in the last months of the war. Machines loaded with explosives deliberately pounced on American ships, especially aircraft carriers. The goal was not only to inflict maximum damage, but also to break the morale of the enemy. The Battle of Okinawa brought this tactic with unprecedented intensity. Again and again, kamikaze planes crashed out of the clouds and tried to hit the decks of the carriers. Some attacks were chaotic and were fired before they could do any damage, but many hit their target. Aircraft carriers such as the USS Bunker Hill, the USS Enterprise, or the USS Franklin were severely damaged. On Bunker Hill, more than 300 men died when two kamikazes struck in quick succession, triggering explosions in the hangar. Despite these losses, the American carriers proved their resilience. Their crews fought tirelessly against fires, explosions, and collapses while maintaining flight operations. Often it was possible to rescue damaged ships, refloat them, and bring them back into battle. This steadfastness was a decisive factor in ensuring that the carrier fleet did not collapse despite the heaviest attacks. Okinawa impressively demonstrated the importance of the carriers for modern warfare. Without them, it would have been impossible to provide air support for the massive landing operations. They launched incessant attacks against Japanese positions, provided cover for the ground troops, and kept the sea routes open. At the same time, however, the battle revealed the vulnerability of these ships. No other target was as much in the focus of the kamikazes as the carriers that formed the heart of the American fleet. In the end, Okinawa fell after weeks of fighting. The price was enormously high, for both sides. Tens of thousands of Japanese defenders died, and American losses were also immense. The kamikaze attacks had shown how far Japan was willing to go, but they could not stop the superiority of the US Navy. Okinawa was a key moment in the history of aircraft carriers. They had proven that they were indispensable despite extreme threats, but at the same time, it became clear that new defense systems would be needed to repel such attacks in the future. The age of rockets and jets was already announced. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki a few months later, the war ended before an invasion of the main islands occurred. But the Battle of Okinawa and the kamikaze attacks remained as a dark memory. Aircraft carriers were the most powerful weapons of the modern age, and at the same time, the most sought-after targets.
Chapter 15. Post-war period. The rise of the supercarriers. With the end of the Second World War, the world was in a completely new order. The old empires lay in ruins, the US and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, and nuclear weapons had shown that warfare would never be the same again. But in addition to the bombs, there was another symbol of global power, the aircraft carrier. While most nations drastically reduced their war fleets, the United States continued to expand its carrier forces. The US had emerged from the war with a massive fleet of dozens of carriers, including the Essex class, which was the backbone of American power. But it was soon realized that the future demanded even bigger, even more powerful ships, the so-called supercarriers. The post-war years brought a revolution in aviation, jet aircraft. These machines were faster, heavier, and needed longer runways than their propeller-driven predecessors. In order to be able to use them from ships, the aircraft carriers had to become larger, with stronger decks, more powerful catapults, and new landing techniques. The U.S. response was the USS United States, a 1949 project intended to be the first supercarrier. With over 80,000 tons of displacement and a huge flight deck, it was to be specially equipped for the use of nuclear weapons. But even before it could be completed, the project was stopped for cost reasons. Instead, the U.S. Navy focused on the expansion and modernization of the Essex class and on the construction of new, somewhat smaller, but state-of-the-art carriers such as the Forrestal class. The Forrestal class, which entered service in the mid-1950s, was a milestone. It had the first introduced sloping flight deck, which made it possible to take off and land at the same time. This allowed jet aircraft to operate more safely, and the efficiency of flight operations increased enormously. In addition, powerful steam catapults were installed, which could also launch heavy machines. While the U.S. developed these new carriers, other nations had far more modest means. Great Britain, the pioneer country of carriers, was able to keep some of its ships in service, but the country's economic situation prevented the construction of real supercarriers. France, the Netherlands, and Australia also experimented with smaller launchers, which could usually accommodate lighter aircraft or vertical takeoff aircraft. In contrast, the U.S. deliberately used the aircraft carrier as an instrument of global power projection. Whether in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, or the Indian Ocean, American carriers appeared everywhere to protect allies and impress opponents. They were floating ambassadors of the Cold War, symbols of U.S. dominance on the world's oceans. So the post-war period was the era when the aircraft carrier went from being a tool of war to a political symbol. Whereas in the Second World War, individual battles had decided on victory or defeat, it was now a matter of showing presence, staking out spheres of influence, and being able to act at all times. The aircraft carrier was no longer just a military tool. It had become a tool of diplomacy. The term supercarrier thus stood not only for size and technology, but also for a new dimension of global power. With these ships, a country was able to have an impact far beyond its borders, an idea that still determines the importance of aircraft carriers today. Chapter 16. Nuclear Age, Aircraft Carriers as Carriers of Nuclear Power. With the end of World War II, the world entered the nuclear age. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown that a single bomb could destroy entire cities. From that moment on, all military planning was directed towards the question of how nuclear weapons could be used, transported, and deterred. For the Navy, this meant that aircraft carriers also had to play a role in this new scenario. Initially, the large bombers of the U.S. Air Force were at the center of the nuclear strategy. They could fly intercontinental and were considered the main weapon against the Soviet Union. But the Navy did not want to be marginalized. Admirals argued that aircraft carriers were flexible, could operate anywhere in the world, and would therefore be faster and closer to their target in an emergency than bombers that had to take off from distant bases. Thus, a phase began in which aircraft carriers were specially prepared for the use of nuclear weapons. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the U.S. Navy experimented with equipping carrier aircraft such as the Douglas A-3 Skywarrior or the A-5 Vigilante to carry atomic bombs. This turned the carrier into a floating launch platform that could appear near the coast at any time and fly a nuclear attack in an emergency. At the same time, the wearers themselves became targets of discussions about their vulnerability. Some strategists claimed that a single nuclear strike could wipe out an entire carrier group and questioned whether it made sense to concentrate so much power into a single ship. But the Navy countered, precisely because carriers were mobile and difficult to detect, they were better suited for deterrence than fixed bases or known air bases. The development of nuclear energy brought yet another revolution. With the USS Enterprise, 1961, the U.S. Navy received its first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. The reactor gave it virtually unlimited range and allowed it to operate for years without a refueling stop. This made the Enterprise and its successors true symbols of global presence. In the nuclear age, it was not only their ability to use nuclear weapons that was crucial, but also the fact that they could be available anywhere and at any time. But the role of carriers in the Cold War was not limited to nuclear weapons alone. They were just as important for conventional operations, for deterrence and demonstrations of power. Whether in the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, or off the coasts of Vietnam, wherever a conflict threatened, an American aircraft carrier often appeared. His mere presence was often enough to send a message. The U.S. was present, vigilant, and ready to act. This was a challenge for the Soviet Union. For a long time, its Navy relied more heavily on submarines and land-based bombers to keep the American carriers at bay. Nevertheless, it also built some of its own girders, albeit smaller ones and conceptually different. The Soviet flight deck cruisers combined missile armament with aircraft but fell far short of the effectiveness of the American supercarriers. The nuclear age made the aircraft carrier more than just a ship. It became an instrument of global strategy embedded in the balance of terror between East and West. It was a flexible tool of deterrence, capable of operating with both conventional and nuclear weapons, and a visible symbol of power projection. This showed that even in the shadow of the atomic bomb, the aircraft carrier remained indispensable. On the contrary, it adapted to the new reality and became a part of the nuclear strategy itself. In doing so, it finally secured its place as one of the central instruments of world politics in the 20th century.
Chapter 17: Vietnam War, America's Floating Air Bases. When the Vietnam War escalated in the 1960s, the United States was faced with a challenge. A guerrilla war in dense jungles, far from home bases, but in a region where political pressure was high and the military presence had to remain visible at all times. In this scenario, the aircraft carriers showed all their strength. They became floating air bases off the coast of Southeast Asia. The Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin became synonymous with this role. Several American carriers were almost permanently stationed there, flying attacks against targets in North Vietnam day and night. F-4 Phantom II, A-4 Skyhawk, or A-6 Intruder took off from their decks, jets that dropped bombs on supply routes, industrial plants, and positions of the North Vietnamese Army. For the U.S. Navy, the war in Vietnam meant continuous operation. The carriers rotated regularly, remained in service for months, and became an integral part of the American war machine. Their flexibility was unbeatable. While air bases in Thailand or South Vietnam were politically and logistically sensitive, the carriers could be relocated at any time without having to rely on the approval of other states. But the war also openly presented the limits and vulnerabilities of the wearers. North Vietnam's air defenses were dense and well-organized, supported by Soviet missiles and radar systems. Again and again, carrier aircraft were shot down, and the losses among the pilots were high. Rescue missions behind enemy lines, so-called search and rescue operations, became dramatic operations that showed how risky even the most modern technology was when it was met with a determined defense. The carriers themselves were spared direct attack, but their reliance on continuous deployment made them symbols of the American war effort. On the decks, thousands of sailors, mechanics, and pilots worked in shifts, often in tropical heat, accompanied by the constant risk of accidents. Explosions caused by misfired missiles or burning fuel lines have repeatedly led to serious disasters in which hundreds of sailors have died. Proof that the greatest danger did not always come from the enemy, but often also from their own operations. Politically, the bearers were a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they demonstrated the unwavering presence of the United States in Southeast Asia. And on the other hand, they also became symbols of the endless violence that many Americans saw on television. The images of jets taking off and dropping bombs on Vietnamese cities and villages shaped the image of the distant war, which found less and less support at home. And yet, the Vietnam War showed that aircraft carriers were not only weapons, but also tools of political control. Without them, the U.S. Navy would not have been able to maintain the intensity of its airstrikes. They were proof that America was capable of using its power at any point on Earth at any time. After the end of the war, the lesson remained clear. Aircraft carriers were indispensable. They had impressively fulfilled their role as floating air bases, and thus consolidated their position as the core of American military power.
Chapter 18: Cold War. Carriers against carriers? NATO versus Soviet Union. After Vietnam, the attention of the American aircraft carriers shifted more strongly to the global stage. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union determined world politics, and the oceans became the invisible scene of a constant trial of strength. While the Pacific and Atlantic were patrolled by the massive carriers of the U.S. Navy, the Soviet Union was also building a fleet aimed at containing these floating symbols of American power. The U.S. Navy relied on its carrier battle groups, huge formations consisting of one or two aircraft carriers, flanked by cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and supply ships. Each of these formations was a mobile fortress, capable of repelling attacks, fighting submarines, and even carrying out massive airstrikes. For NATO, these formations were the backbone of naval deterrence. They could surface in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, or the Pacific and immediately send a signal to Moscow. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, pursued a different strategy. It did not build classic supercarriers based on the American model, but so-called flight deck cruisers, such as the Kiev class. These ships combined missile armaments with aircraft, but mostly vertical takeoff aircraft, such as the Yak-38. They were not as powerful as American carriers, but together with a dense network of submarines and land-based bombers, they were intended to restrict the freedom of movement of the U.S. fleets. Particularly dangerous for the American carriers were the Soviet nuclear submarines, which were armed with long-range missiles. Their task was to attack and eliminate a sponsoring association in an emergency. At the same time, the Soviets developed special bombers, such as the Tupolev T-22M backfire, which could fly over the sea at low altitude and fire anti-ship missiles at supersonic speeds. It was therefore crucial for the U.S. Navy to have its carriers constantly protected by escort ships and reconnaissance aircraft. But despite these threats, the Soviet Union never succeeded in breaking the dominance of the U.S. carriers. Their aircraft were inferior to American jets, their carriers were smaller and more technically limited, and their fleet as a whole was more defensive. The USA, on the other hand, was able to draw on decades of experience with large carrier operations, which gave it an immense advantage. In the Cold War, it was often not the battle that counted, but the presence. When an American carrier appeared in the Mediterranean, it was a message to Moscow, and at the same time a signal to NATO allies. The U.S. was there to protect. In crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, or in the Middle East during the 1970s, porters were deliberately used to show strength without fighting directly. At the same time, the Cold War was a time of permanent innovation.
Electronic early warning aircraft such as the E-2 Hawkeye were introduced, which patrolled over the carrier formations and detected approaching threats at an early stage. New jets such as the F-14 Tomcat with its long-range Phoenix missiles made it possible to intercept enemy bombers even before they could fire their missiles. The sponsoring association thus became an almost unassailable bulwark. For NATO, the aircraft carriers were more than just military platforms. They were a political tool that showed how close the alliance was together. British, French, and later Italian carriers complemented the American ones, albeit on a smaller scale. But the message was clear. The Western world relied on aircraft carriers to project power and protection worldwide. When the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the 1980s, it was clear that the concept of the supercarrier had won out in global competition. The US Navy was able to move its fleets freely across the world's oceans, while the Soviet flight deck cruisers became symbols of a strategy that never quite worked. Chapter 19. The Falklands Crisis, 1982, British Carriers and Emergencies. In the spring of 1982, the eyes of the world turned to a remote archipelago in the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands. What initially began as a local territorial conflict between Argentina and Great Britain quickly developed into an armed conflict in which aircraft carriers once again demonstrated their central importance. On April 2, 1982, Argentina occupied the islands it considered part of its territory, while Britain insisted on its colonial claims. For Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, not only the territory, but also the credibility of Great Britain was at stake. But the Falklands were over 12,000 kilometers away, a distance that could only be bridged by the power of the Royal Navy. At the center of the British recapture fleet were two aircraft carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. They were not supercarriers like the American Colossi, but smaller ships with Sea Harrier vertical takeoff aircraft. Nevertheless, they were the heart of the operation. Without their planes, the reconquest of the islands would have been simply impossible. The Sea Harriers quickly proved to be decisive. Argentina had modern jets such as the Mirage 3 and the Super Étendard, but their range was limited. The British carriers, on the other hand, were able to deploy their aircraft directly near the islands and thus create permanent air supremacy. In numerous air battles, the Sea Harriers shot down over 20 Argentine aircraft without suffering major losses themselves. Their maneuverability, their armament, and the skillful tactics of the pilots made the difference. But the British were also under pressure. Argentine planes carried out daring attacks on the fleet, often with low-flying missions that outsmarted British radar systems. Exocet missiles were used, a new threat that proved to be extremely dangerous. The destruction of the destroyer HMS Sheffield by an Exocet hit Britain hard and made it clear how vulnerable even a modern fleet was. If one of these missiles had hit one of the two launchers, the entire operation would have been jeopardized. However, the carriers themselves remained unscathed, and their aircraft not only ensured air supremacy, but also supported the landing of British troops on the islands. Without them, the soldiers could neither have been protected nor cared for. The success of the operation, the recapture of the Falklands after only 10 weeks, was largely based on the striking power of the two carriers. Politically, the victory had immense consequences. In Great Britain, it significantly strengthened Thatcher's position and gave the country new self-confidence as a maritime power. Internationally, it showed that even smaller carriers, if used correctly, could be strategically decisive. The Falklands War was a confirmation of the history of aircraft carriers. Even in the age of rockets and satellites, the carrier remained indispensable when it came to deploying military power far from home. The Royal Navy had shown that it was able to successfully conduct a complex operation even without American supercarriers, as long as it could rely on its carriers. The lesson was clear. If you didn't have aircraft carriers, you couldn't survive in such a scenario. Those who had it had a tool that tipped the scales even under the most difficult conditions. Chapter 20. The 1990s, Operation Desert Storm and the Global Presence. With the end of the Cold War, the world order seemed to become clearer for a moment. The Soviet Union collapsed, the East-West conflict was over, and the United States stood as the undisputed superpower. In this new era of the 1990s, the aircraft carriers played a central role. They became symbols of American presence in a world that did without the old bloc confrontation, but was by no means peaceful. This was most evident in 1991 during the Gulf War. After Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, an international coalition led by the US formed to reverse the invasion. In this Operation Desert Storm, aircraft carriers were indispensable. Several American carriers, including the USS Midway, USS Ranger, USS America, and USS Theodore Roosevelt, operated in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. From their decks, hundreds of missions were launched against Iraqi targets, air defense positions, communication centers, tank columns, and troop positions. Within a few days, the carrier aircraft had conquered air supremacy, together with land-based jets. Without this superiority, the ground war that liberated Kuwait would hardly have been so fast and successful. The wearers once again proved their flexibility. While air bases in Saudi Arabia or other states were politically controversial, the carriers were able to operate freely off the coast. They were mobile, independent, and deployable at any time, an advantage that was invaluable in the chaotic conditions of the Middle East. But the 1990s also showed the importance of the wearers beyond the Gulf War. In the turmoil of the disintegrating Yugoslavia, they were used to enforce no-fly zones and to support humanitarian missions. In the Indian Ocean, off Somalia, and in other crisis regions, carrier units repeatedly appeared that promised stability or exerted military pressure. Politically, the carriers became more than ever an instrument of global presence in this decade. After the end of the Soviet Union, there was no longer any equal competition. The US was able to send its carriers freely across the oceans, and their mere presence was enough to influence parties to the conflict. No other country had anything like it. The American supercarriers were unique in their power and reach. At the same time, the next generation of these ships was prepared in the 1990s. The Nimitz class, which had already been introduced in the 1970s, remained the backbone, but its modernizations made it fit for the new age. Electronics, radar, and armament were constantly improved, and carrier aircraft changed from purely analog machines to jets that increasingly used digital technologies. The 1990s were thus a phase in which aircraft carriers had to maintain their status not through direct duels with equal opponents, but through their ability to be present everywhere. They became a tool of the Pax America, the phase in which the USA was the only superpower to shape the world order. Whether in the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, or the Western Pacific, wherever crises developed, an aircraft carrier could appear. And his message was always the same: America was there.
Chapter 21: The Era of Nuclear Carriers, Nimitz Class, and Gerald R. Ford. With the transition to the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the aircraft carrier finally became a symbol of high-tech, global power and technological superiority. At the center of this development was the American Nimitz class, a series of supercarriers that set the standards for size, effectiveness, and logistics for decades. The USS Nimitz was launched in 1975 and was the first of a total of 10 ships of this class. With a displacement of over 100,000 tons, a length of over 330 meters, and space for more than 70 aircraft, it was the largest warship in the world and remained so for decades. At its heart was nuclear propulsion. 2 nuclear reactors powered the giant, giving it practically unlimited range and allowing it to be used for many years without ever having to refuel. This allowed the ships to operate worldwide, regardless of supply routes or fuel ports. The Nimitz class was not just a ship, it was a floating small town. With a crew of over 5,000 sailors, pilots, technicians, and staff officers, it functioned like a self-sufficient organism. In their hangars and on their flight deck, there was a constant coming and going of jets, helicopters, and supply planes. Each mission was a logistical masterpiece that required precision and coordination. Technically, the ships were designed in such a way that they could operate around the clock. Steam catapults accelerated the aircraft to takeoff speed in fractions of a second, and safety ropes abruptly slowed them down during landing. Electronic systems coordinated all air traffic, while radar and interceptors protected the unit from threats. In combination with cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and supply ships, the carriers formed the famous carrier strike groups, mobile fortresses that could establish military superiority in any region of the world. The Nimitz class was the backbone of American power projection during the Cold War and after. Whether in the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, or the Pacific, wherever American interests were affected, these supercarriers appeared. They have been present in the wars against Iraq, in Afghanistan, in humanitarian missions, and in countless crises. Their flexibility made them the universal tools of the U.S. Navy. But the world did not stand still. In the 21st century, new requirements became clear. The operation of the old steam catapults was expensive and complex, the electronics were from the 1960s, and the growing threat of precision rockets demanded innovation. Therefore, the U.S. Navy began to develop a new generation, the Gerald R. Ford class. The USS Gerald R. Ford was commissioned in 2017 and embodies the next tier of supercarriers. Larger and more modern than its predecessors, it relies on electromagnetic catapults instead of steam, a system that works more efficiently and can also launch lighter drones. Their reactors are more powerful, their electronics are state-of-the-art, and their deck design allows for faster and smoother flight operations. The Ford class is not only a further development, but a statement. Even in the 21st century, the USA continues to rely on aircraft carriers as a central instrument of its power. Critics repeatedly ask whether supercarriers have become vulnerable in the face of modern missile weapons. But proponents emphasize that no other weapon system has the same flexibility, presence, and symbolic power. The era of nuclear carriers has thus created a continuity that is unique. From the Nimitz to the Ford, a clear message emerges. As long as the United States claims its role as a global power of order, its aircraft carriers will remain the most visible symbol of that power. Gigantic cities of steel that control the skies with their decks and extend their reach across the world's oceans.
Chapter 22. China, Russia, and New Players, the Aircraft Carrier in the 21st Century. In the 21st century, the aircraft carrier is no longer just the symbol of American power. Other states have begun to invest in this prestigious and strategically crucial type of weapon. China, in particular, entered the scene, followed by Russia, India, and some smaller nations. This changed the image of the world's oceans. Aircraft carriers became the centerpiece of new ambitions and the visible calling card of emerging powers. China, which for decades had no supporting tradition worth mentioning, surprised the world in the 2010s with rapid progress. The first step was the Lianoying, a former Soviet ship that was acquired and modernized in Ukraine. It was primarily for educational purposes, but it marked the beginning of a massive program. This was soon followed by the Shandong, China's first self-built carrier, and finally Beijing announced the construction of other, even larger ships with state-of-the-art technology. The goal was clear. China wanted to develop its navy from a coastal defense fleet to a globally active naval power. The significance of this development can hardly be overestimated. With aircraft carriers, China is able to project its interests far beyond the Western Pacific. They enable presence in the Indian Ocean, Africa, and other regions where China is economically and politically active. For the U.S. and its allies, this is a signal that the Pacific is increasingly becoming the scene of a new rivalry in the 21st century, and that the aircraft carrier is once again playing a central role in it. Russia, on the other hand, built its tradition of carrying on the remnants of the Soviet Union. Their only large ship, the Admiral Kuznetsov, is notorious for its breakdowns, failures, and thick plume of smoke. Nevertheless, it symbolizes Russia's claim to continue to play in the First League. Their operations off Syria showed that Russia also uses its bearers as a political message, even if their actual military clout is limited. India, on the other hand, positioned itself as a regional power with global ambitions. With the INS Vikramaditya, a converted Soviet ship, and the INS Vikrant, a self-built carrier, the country demonstrated its ability to independently build modern warships of this category. For India, porters are a tool to ensure balance in the Indian Ocean and balance China's growing influence in the region. Smaller nations such as Great Britain, Italy, and Japan have also revived their own carrier programs. The Royal Navy commissioned two new large carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, which operate together with F-35B vertical takeoff aircraft. Japan, traditionally constrained by its post-war constitution, rebuilt its helicopter carriers to accommodate the F-35B as well, a move that symbolically marks Japan's return to offensive capabilities. All these developments show that the aircraft carrier remains a status symbol in the 21st century. Anyone who owns a carrier demonstrates not only military clout, but also technological competence, industrial strength, and political ambition. They are far more than just ships. They are floating signs of the claim to play a significant role in world politics. Of course, there are voices claiming that the aircraft carrier has become vulnerable to modern hypersonic missiles, submarines, or drone swarms. But the fact that more and more countries are investing in carriers speaks a different language. Despite all the threats, their symbolic and practical meaning remains unbroken. This makes the aircraft carrier what it became in the 20th century, the most visible sign of national strength and the ultimate tool for projecting military power beyond the world's oceans.
Chapter 23: Technology and the Future: Drones, Catapults, and the Next Generation. The aircraft carrier of the 21st century is not just a continuation of the supercarrier of the Nimitz era, but a step into a future shaped by technology, automation, and new forms of warfare. As the massive steel giants continue to traverse the oceans, the machines that take off from their decks are changing, as are the systems that make their use possible. One of the most important innovations is drones. Unmanned aircraft have already proven that they can perform reconnaissance, surveillance, and even combat missions. The U.S. Navy experimented early on with models such as the X-47B, which could take off from a carrier deck and land independently, a technical masterpiece. In the future, drones will serve not only as the eyes and ears of the carrier fleet, but also as tankers for manned jets, as electronic combat aircraft, or even as full-fledged combat machines. This would allow the carriers to extend their range enormously without endangering pilots. At the same time, the technology of catapults is being revolutionized. Instead of the classic steam catapults, the new Gerald R. Ford class relies on electromagnetic systems, the so-called EMALS, Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System. This system not only allows for more precise takeoffs and a faster sequence of flights, but can also more easily handle different types of aircraft, from heavy jets to light drones. This increases the flexibility of the entire carrier operation and reduces wear and tear on the machines. There is also progress in landings. New hook systems, computer-aided assistance, and automated controls make the riskiest phase of flight operations safer. Pilots are supported by digital displays and precise control software, while drones can return to board fully automatically. But the future of aircraft carriers is not only a question of technology on board, but also a question of strategy. Modern threats such as hypersonic missiles or sophisticated submarines pose the question of how long the supercarriers can remain unchallenged in their current form. The answer lies in the combination of defense systems, escort ships, and new tactics. Missile defense systems, camouflage technologies, and even closer networking of satellites, drones, and ships are intended to reduce vulnerability. At the same time, ideas for completely new types of carriers are emerging. Some concepts envision smaller, modular beams that are lighter and cheaper to build and can be used in larger numbers. Other designs are thinking in the direction of carriers for exclusively unmanned systems, which would be even more compact but at the same time powerful. The environment and costs will also play a role in the future. A supercarrier today costs over $10 billion, and operations devour billions annually. Whether states can afford or want to maintain such gigantic ships in the future is an open question. Some experts predict a return to more but smaller ships that can be used more flexibly. But one thing remains undisputed: the aircraft carrier has the ability to transform. From the improvised wooden decks of the First World War, to the armored giants of the Second World War, to the nuclear-powered supercarriers of the present day, he has always integrated new technology and found new roles. It is therefore likely that it will not disappear in the future, but will reinvent itself as a platform for drones, a hub for digital warfare, and a symbol of global presence.
So, the next generation of aircraft carriers will be no less impressive than its predecessors. Maybe they will look different, maybe smaller, or more automated. But their message remains the same. Whoever controls the sea controls access to the world, and the aircraft carrier is the most powerful tool to do just that. Chapter 24. Conclusion: Symbol of Power Projection and the Future of Naval Warfare. If you look at the history of aircraft carriers, there is a huge arc, from the first rickety attempts to launch biplanes from makeshift wooden ramps to today's supercarriers, which move across the oceans like floating cities. In little more than a century, an idea that was once considered an exotic experiment has become the most powerful tool of global politics. The aircraft carrier is more than just a warship. It is a stage where technology, strategy, and symbolism come together. In the First World War, it was only small missions that showed that aircraft could also be used at sea. In the 1920s and 1930s, the concepts matured, and in World War II, the porters took the lead role. Pearl Harbor, Midway, Okinawa, all these names are inextricably linked to the decks of the carriers. They decided battles, wars, and ultimately the world order. During the Cold War, their role changed. It was no longer a matter of defeating enemy fleets in open battles, but of showing presence and deterrence. Carrier groups patrolled all oceans. They were the visible signs of the rivalry between East and West. In the Vietnam War and the Gulf War, they showed how flexibly they could be used, as floating air force bases independent of political borders. Today, in the 21st century, they are once again at the center of geopolitical developments. The US continues to rely on its huge supercarriers, while new players such as China and India are trying to rise to the league of world powers with their own carriers. Smaller nations such as Great Britain or Japan use modernized carriers as part of their global strategy. The following applies everywhere. Anyone who owns aircraft carriers not only has military clout, but also prestige, influence, and symbolic power. But the future raises questions. Can these gigantic ships survive in the face of new threats from hypersonic missiles, drones, and cyber warfare? Or will their concept change again, towards smaller, more flexible platforms, perhaps without any crews at all? One thing is certain: the wearer has reinvented itself again and again in its history, and it will continue to do so. At its core, however, its message remains unchanged. The aircraft carrier is the most visible sign of a nation that does not want to limit its power to its coasts, but wants to project it beyond the oceans. It is a tool, symbol, and stage at the same time, a combination that makes it unique. So when a supercarrier enters a port or appears off a coast, it's not just a military signal. It is a message to the world. We are here, we have the means, and we have the will to use them. This message is the true meaning of the aircraft carrier, then, now, and probably in the future.